Okay, cool. Let's get started. So today, the workshop we'll be covering would be marketing your product. And essentially, I'm going to be going over some of the strategies for getting your product out into public, basically. And the check-in code for this would be prod marketing. So if you guys aren't aware, if you go to acmucsc.com, essentially will be a little section to enter check-in codes. And if you enter the prod marketing, you should be able to get points for that. And I think if you get a certain amount of points, I believe you're able to purchase stuff at the store. I'm not sure if that's open yet, but yeah, you guys should check it out. And you guys can see my screen, right? Just in case. Okay, cool, bet. So I'll just go into a bit of recap from last workshop, and essentially this is about product market fit. So, and the reason why I want to give a bit of a recap for the previous session is because before you start extensively marketing your product, you want to ensure that you have found product market fit, as marketing can be pretty costly and timely, right? So you want to essentially make sure that you have a product that people are actually like want to purchase and use, and you have some sort of traction before you start having a big market, right? And so just a summary from last time workshop, product market fit is essentially the degree to which your product satisfies a strong market. Simply put it, it's basically, is your product really solving the problem that you have, and are you doing it well, right? And a great quote regarding product market fit would be, the customers are buying the product just as fast as you can make it, or usage is growing just as fast as you can add more servers. Money from customers is piling up on your company checking account. You're hiring sales and customer support staff as fast as you can. And to put it another way, it's basically like you reach product market fit when you're overwhelmed with usage, usually to the point where you can't even make major changes to your product because you're swamped just keeping it up and running, right? And so you can track whether you've hit product market fit through some of the strategies that were covered last workshop, and primarily keeping track of the data as well. Make sure that essentially the retention is high and customers are actually coming towards your product and using it for a long duration of time, basically. Cool. Now that this is all going to be on the assumption that you hit product market fit, or at least you're getting close to it, right? So I want to basically go into startup marketing now, and it's a little different from traditional marketing. And I think there's a lot of founders that have this initial misconception where you have it where you build it and users will come, right? And so, these founders have this misconception where once you build something like a great product, users will just come naturally to you, right? But the reality is it doesn't really work like that. And a lot of these overnight success stories you hear are often result of many years behind the scenes and just a lot of stuff and effort they had to put in, right, behind the scenes, eventually to the point where they have like a big breakthrough and everyone hears about them, basically, right? So basically I want to basically emphasize that this marketing and this whole process of getting your startup out there is just sort of an iterative process, and one that can take many, many years. Okay, and the reason why startup marketing is especially difficult and complex is because you have limited resources, right? Limited resources in time, money, or talents, right? And this is essentially very different from maybe like a company that's already established that has maybe a huge budget or maybe a ton of talent and time to be able to allocate towards marketing efforts, right? But as a startup that just pretty much recently launched and don't have a huge team or budgets, it's extremely difficult, right? And another reason why startup marketing is difficult is because traditional marketing does not really mesh well with startups, and you sort of need to take a different approach. And what I mean by traditional marketing is that these are strategies that are generally used by big and established companies that have built up their brand and product for decades, right? And so this kind of marketing is very brand centric focus in the sense that you're essentially targeting customers and to trying to make them feel a certain way with your brand, right? An example of this would be Apple, right? Everyone has an iPhone, everyone has a MacBook, right? And it makes them feel smart, it makes them feel included, right? Another example of this could be Nike, right? It's like when you purchase the product, you make yourself feel fit, athletic, whatever it is, right? These traditional marketing strategies are employed by big companies to make your customers and your market feel a certain way, right? And the reason why these marketing strategies don't really work too well with startups is because startups, essentially, when you have a brand new concept, new product into the market, a lot of customers and a lot of people that are essentially looking at this really won't have a good understanding of what your product will be doing, right? It's not been in the market for many, many years. It's pretty new. It's a new concept. So a lot of people won't really understand what your product is for or what it's doing, right? And so basically, no one really wants to buy a product they don't understand, regardless of how they feel about the product, right? And so that's why these traditional marketing strategies that are brand centric and are focused on essentially making your customers feel a certain way won't really work too well. And so you want to essentially target startup marketing in a different way where you're focusing on more of the educational response behind it, right? And more of the educational and explaining what your product does, right? To essentially make sure your customer base that you're targeting understands clearly what your startup is and the product and the value proposition that it offers. Plus, it doesn't have an existing community of users. Right, exactly. As a startup, it's you're essentially building that community first, right? It's not like traditional companies that have existing communities of people that are really into your brand, right? I know there's a few people or a lot of people in the United States that are really into Apple products, right? They're basically evangelists for your product, right? They have a community built around it and they essentially promote your product naturally, right? As a startup, you don't have the same community, right? You're essentially trying to build that up from the ground up, which is extremely difficult to do. And so you have to take a very creative and a different approach to traditional companies. Okay, so basically, the next few slides are essentially going to cover some of the fundamental steps for startup marketing and essentially what that entails, right? And one of the initial steps, or I guess one of the fundamental things you want to establish first is choosing your markets, right? And it's really easy for startup founders to believe that everyone will love their products, right? And it's pretty natural, right? Because founders essentially with their products will have been working with it for a long time. They've essentially built this from the ground up. They've talked to a lot of customers, etc. So it's very natural for founders to believe that everyone will essentially love their products, right? In reality, this is really not the case, and only a small portion of the market will actually want your product, right? And so if you try to market your product to everybody, right, to the entire markets, you'll only be wasting time and money as not everyone will be receptive towards it, right? And so the strategy behind this is you want to essentially target a market that's strictly and specifically wants to love your product, or I guess has a strong need for your product, right? The question is, how do you choose that market, right? And there's four main factors that you want to consider, right? Market size, market wealth, market competition, and value proposition, right? So I'll go into a bit of these points in a bit more detail. And so the first point is market size, right? Are you targeting a regional demographic, right? So what portion of the market are you targeting? Are you targeting maybe males? Are you targeting college students? Are you targeting children? And you want to essentially narrow this down specifically as you can when you initially have a marketing plan, right? You want to be specific and narrow down your customer base to as small as possible to essentially get that initial set of customers that will be evangelists for your product, that really, really have a need for your product and that will essentially love your product when it's released, right? And you want to essentially know how many potential customers are in that target market, right? And I think there's like a set of analyses that you can sort of go about and research as well. I think it's like the TAM, SAM, SOM analysis, which is total addressable market, which is essentially if all goes well, how big can your product essentially capture the market, right? The entire market of people that would be able to use your product, right? And then you essentially break it down into specific components where you're targeting, right? Maybe you're targeting a specific section of that market where it might entail college students only, et cetera, et cetera. And so you want to essentially boil this down and get as much facts as possible and data to essentially ensure that you have the right amount, right? A rough estimate. Cool. Whoops. Go back. And feel free to drop any questions you guys have as we're going through this. Cool. The next factor that I want to talk about is market wealth. And this is basically the question of, does this market have the money to spend on your products, right? And so what this means is, let's say you've targeted college students, for example, as your market size or the market you're targeting, right? So do college students have the money to be able to purchase your product, right? So let's say you're making, I don't know, a super cool, phone, it's brand new, or maybe like a super cool computer that's really expensive, right? Might be 10K or something, right? It's this really brand new computer. It's amazing. It's got all the highest functionality, right? Maybe you might want to reconsider the market you're targeting, right? Because if you're targeting college students in particular, are college students really going to have a surplus of wealth they can actually and money to be able to purchase your product? Not a good majority, right? So you probably want to target a different market size in that case, right? Maybe like established companies or businesses that actually do need this high power computer, right? And so basically you want to essentially make sure that whoever customer you base you're targeting has the actual, you know, money to be able to purchase your product. Cool. Next one I want to cover is market competition, right? And so what this means is the market saturated? Is there one big player in the market right now, like a huge competitor? Or is it sort of fragmented into different competitors in the market that essentially don't have a strong hold on the market, but there's a lot of them out there, right? And so you want to determine sort of what the fragmentation and concentration of your market is to essentially make sure, hey, do I have a chance, right, in this market, right? A good example of this would be like market competition would be maybe like food delivery, right? So there's huge players in the market right now where you have maybe like Uber Eats, DoorDash, Grubhub, Postmates, etc. These are big competitors in the market right now. It's very concentrated into like maybe like a handful of competitors, right? So if you were to enter this market, would you have enough that network effect to be able to steal some of that competition, right? Or maybe a less diluted marketplace could be something like, I'm not sure, but maybe like a marketplace that is selling like dog toys, for example, right? I'm not really familiar with like one huge competitor. So it might be the case that there's like a bunch of fragmented competitors that are out there. There are a lot of them, but there's no one big competitor in the market right now. Next thing I want to talk about is value proposition, right? And basically what this means is your value proposition, is your company basically unique enough? And is there big enough of a differentiating point to be able to cut through all this noise, cut through all the competitors, and have your customers that you're targeting really switch over to your products, right? To have your company be the one that is essentially solving their problems, right? Offering the perfect solution for them, right? And so do you have that value proposition? Do you have enough value for your customers to essentially be able to switch over, right? Is what it's saying. And so you want to consider all of these before you essentially proceed further, basically. Cool. The next thing you want to do after you define the market is basically build a keyword list, which are a set of keywords that are highly relevant to your markets or products, right? And so what this means is, I guess this can be sort of broken down into two different categories where you have core keywords, which are essentially 3 to 5 words that completely summarize your startup, right? And so just from these 3 to 5 words, I should be able to completely understand what your startup is doing, what the product is, and the market as well, right? And then you got the secondary keywords, which are around 10 to 20 words, basically, that essentially add more details. These might be like related topics regarding your product, but they're not a core, they're not essential to your product, right? So maybe if you're doing food delivery, right, you have core things where it's like you have delivery, food, community, etc. And there's like secondary words that are maybe related to that, right? Maybe like college food pickup, right? Different restaurants, etc. Right? Those would be secondary keywords and core keywords. And there's a bit of a distinction between that, right? Where core keywords are essentially necessary to describing your company and your product, while secondary keywords are related keywords that are basically related to your startup, right? And this is really not only useful for the direction and basically the vision for the company, but it can be later applied and used in social media, search engine optimization, and blogs as well. Cool. Next thing you want to do is define success, right? And success can be very different for every startup, but it's important to find its goal very early on, right? You want to write this down and essentially make sure your entire team knows what you're working towards, right? Because it's very hard to continue to proceed with the startup and to continue moving forward when you guys don't have a clear defined goal that you want to achieve, right? So maybe like a long-term goal of this would be to maybe get acquired, right? For maybe $3 million or get 100K customers on here at one point, right? So you want to be very specific and also be rigid and consistent. And what I mean by this is essentially you don't want to have a goal that you set right now and change as you have different metrics that come up, right? So you want to be very rigid and consistent with this. This is essentially your North Star metric, right? The thing that you're aiming for completely, right? At the very end of this, what are you trying to achieve with this startup? And an example of this could be maybe like a monthly goal where it's like, hey, I want to essentially have 500 signups monthly, or maybe 50K revenue monthly, right? And so these are some examples of goals that you can set. Should we be rigid and consistent even if we aren't seeing the desired results? Yes, I believe it depends on what goals you're talking about. But if you're talking about the North Star metric, where this end goal of your startup, like what is your startup trying to accomplish? I think you should be rigid and consistent with that, even if you aren't seeing the desired results, right? And the reason why is because if you fail to meet these goals on a consistent basis, maybe it's time for you to pivot, right? Your startup completely, right? And you want to essentially make sure that the North Star metric or the big goal that you're trying to achieve just is consistent throughout, right? You don't change that and you're not really changing the direction and vision of the company. Cool. So after we've defined success, what that means for your company, you want to essentially now go into metrics, right? How do you determine whether you've actually met your goals or success, right? And you shouldn't just define a goal / define success without any tangible way to measure it, right? So you want to be able to actually set metrics that are measurable and specific, and you want to avoid vanity metrics. And what I mean by vanity metrics is essentially metrics that really don't add too much value or don't add too much detail or data to tracking progress, but it's more of like metrics that feel your ego, right? It makes you feel like you're actually succeeding, right? And the reason why you don't want to have vanity metrics is because you really won't know your startup is a complete success or a flop until it's basically too late, right? And so you want to be very real and very authentic and just very transparent with the metrics that you're setting to essentially ensure that you're able to track whether you're actually going towards your goals or basically not able to meet them, right? And so, yeah, constantly record growth and progress and make sure you have some sort of baseline metrics that you have established from the early beginning to make sure that you have an understanding of how much you're improving by, right? What are the different things that are working for your startup, right? So with the early example of maybe you want a monthly goal of 500 new signups, one metric that you can use, maybe like a KPI, would be to track the number of daily signups, right? If your goal was to essentially reach 10K revenue this month, you can maybe track revenue daily or weekly. Okay. The last thing you want to essentially clarify and establish before you move on to some of the different channels that you can target would be the budgets, right? And this is very straightforward. How much money can you actually afford to spend, right? And this will really affect some of the direction and some of the channels that you would actually be using for your marketing strategy, right? As the less money you have available, the more creative you'll probably have to be. And sometimes actually having too much capital can actually be bad for your startup as it sort of gets you to be lazy and sort of just throw money at different channels, right? And it kind of limits and stifles your creativity. That is essential characteristic of startups. And once you have some sort of idea for the budget you have, you want to essentially allocate this in different channels that you might be dividing this. Okay, and once all of these fundamentals have been established, you can start actually going about exploring the different channels that are available and make sense for your startup, right? The first one that I want to cover is social media, right? And it's probably one of the biggest and most popular ways to promote your content and marketing, right? Different strategies, and there's many different strategies and tactics to get the most out of your social media campaign. And I'll just be covering a few of them just to make sure that your marketing strategy is efficient and effective. Okay. And the first thing I want to cover is choosing the right social media networks, right? Some of the biggest mistakes that startups will be making initially would be to simply pick the networks that everyone is using, right? I know the biggest trend right now is going on TikTok, right? TikTok or Instagram, whatever, right? And so the misconception would be, hey, everyone else is doing it. I should be on it too, right? While that could be true for some aspects, it's not necessarily always true. So you want to pick the networks and essentially channels best fit for your startup, your product, and essentially your vision and direction, right? Because all of these products are, I guess, popular social media platforms all have their unique characteristics, right? So Instagram, for example, is very image based, right? Twitter is more text and link based, and TikTok could, have a better response to videos, right? So depending on the channels and what their sort of unique characteristics are, you want to essentially target that specific channel that really matches with your vision and your products. Yeah. And another example of this is like each social network sort of works differently, as in how the community takes, interprets, and digests your sharing and content, right? So you really need to take different approaches, right? For example, let's say you want to promote your startup on Reddit, right? I know Reddit is basically the community is very tight knit and doesn't really like the continuous text and spam. So maybe you need to take a slower approach for Reddit, right? Twitter, on the other hand, you're always tweeting, right? There's constant tweets and retweets, and you sort of need to be doing this continuously to be relevant on Twitter. Okay, and the next thing I want to talk about in social media is, okay, if you have capital and bandwidth to do it, would it be smart to just try to post all major social networks instead of trying to choose ones in particular? Or is that not a smart strategy? That's a good question. I think if you definitely have the capital and the bandwidth, I think trying to utilize different social media networks, right, could be ideal, right? And accumulating some data, right, to see which social media, I guess, platforms respond best to you, right? And so what I'm saying, like when I say pick the right ones, you can essentially speculate depending on your product, but it's also very wise and smart to essentially accumulate that data from actually experiment. So couple that with metrics to choose which ones to really go. Yeah, exactly. Cool. Yep, of course. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is utilizing keywords that you set up earlier, right? And so this is basically using social media and some of the keywords that you set up to essentially, basically drive your marketing strategies on these platforms. Next one would be creating and using an influencer list, right? And so basically the premise behind this is it might take several years and a lot of time/effort for your startup to develop influential relationships with thousands of people, right? Instead of spending a ton of time on that, you can rather try to find people that actually already have done that, right? And the biggest sort of people that or I guess the most prevalent ones would be influencers, right? So maybe making a list of influencers that match your product vision and market space and values that are aligned can be a great partnership to form basically, and have influencers utilize influencers to be able to promote your products, right? Last one I want to cover with social media would be starting a blog, right? So you can write blog articles about topics regarding your product, right? So let's say you were making a new phone, you might have blog regarding, maybe set up a blog regarding phones, like breaking down each components, different comparisons, like what's essentially on the market. And will essentially bring up some, I guess, have you established domain expertise, right? And can be one of the best ways to gain implicit trust without it seeming like you're selling a product, right? And so people are more likely to trust you now that it seems like you have a lot of expertise in these areas. Yeah, and also this could be a great way to build up community, as a lot of people, as the more people read your product, you can basically let them know, hey, I've actually started a company that's selling this, right? So this is a great way to build community and just more trust in general with and credibility as well for your company and just yourself. Cool, and that's pretty much it for social media. And the next sort of channel that I want to cover would be PR, right? And basically what PR is, it's a strategy of reaching out to news, industry blog, etc., to get your startup out there, right? And maybe this could be getting your news stories or article published somewhere, right? To get PR and blogs and news to actually publish an article, it really boils down to when you say it, how you say it, and what you say, right? And so the two different strategies you can sort of have to go about getting PR would be one, to craft meaningful positional statements. So basically, what this means is you want to tell them what the product is and how it will affect others, right? When you're crafting this message, don't think of this as a product, but rather a solution to an important problem. And you basically are stating, clearly need to state what your product is and the value that you offer, right? It should be very clear. It should be it should be very clear to the audience and the people that you're basically trying to get them to promote your article, like what your position is, right? What's the value that you add and what your product is clearly, right? And the next thing you want to do is define startup sensitivities. And what I mean by this is essentially you need to position yourself to display to the public that your startup is better than your competitors, right? So why is your startup the one that is going to be able to solve these problems? Why not some other competitor, right? And so what you want to do in this article maybe is essentially take a bunch of data, right, from your competitors and use creativity to display them in meaningful ways, right? You might have a pie chart, bar chart, whatever it is. Maybe use visuals, essentially comparing your competitors to yourself and why you are essentially better than them, right? And so, a lot of people, when you're crafting this, is you want to have a clear and meaningful position, but also show them why you over the others in the markets. Cool. And those are basically the two channels that I really wanted to cover today. And one thing I want to touch up on is once you have some of these channels established, you want to constantly be testing and iterating, right? So like you mentioned earlier, there's no one channel that might be best for your startup. So it's really hard to find just from that very beginning. So you're going to constantly be having to try different things out, right? Try different channels out, see which ones work best for you, and just continue to hone in on that, right? And some of the channels that I covered today, maybe like social media and PR, while those are very prevalent and important, there's many different ways to actually go about marketing startup, right? And the reason why startups are very versatile is because you can try many different things, right? So you can get very creative with it. Maybe you have like a raffle on campus. Maybe you have different ways of promoting your brand and your products that would, stray away from traditional strategies, right? So you want to constantly be testing this, right? And constantly be iterating based on actual metrics and data that you accumulate through some of these strategies, right? So just really overall, try to get creative with it and constantly test new things. Okay. And some closing thoughts that I have for you guys would be remember to sell the solution rather than the product or the problem, right? But so what I mean by this is essentially there's one of the biggest problems that a lot of founders make is essentially when they're promoting and marketing their product, they're actually talking more about the problem and the product rather than the solution, right? And they spend, basically the emphasis should be while the problem is important, you should be selling your product and how it actually solves these problems that users actually have, right? And another thing I want to touch up on is while it's important to have a lot of facts and just educational responses and marketing strategies behind your product, the biggest and most powerful tactic that you already have is storytelling, right? And storytelling is just a very powerful tool. So make sure you have a story, compelling story, and utilize that to essentially track us, have customers be a part of that vision and the direction of the startup. Cool. I think that is it for today. So if you guys have any further questions, I'll just be sticking around for a little bit. So just feel free to unmute yourself or just drop any questions that you have in chat. Yep, of course.